Well, it's 9:05, so I'm just going to jump right in. I see we still got some more people coming into the session as we go, but I figured just jump right into it. So hopefully we have maximum time for talking and bouncing ideas afterwards, because that's kind of my favorite part of these sessions. So I'll first give a quick background intro to myself, and then jump right into my talk on assessing US-China AI capabilities. So my name is Matt Sheehan. I'm a research fellow at MacroPolo, which is the think tank of the Paulson Institute in Chicago. The Paulson Institute is a think tank that generally covers US-China relations. And at MacroPolo, I specifically cover the US-China technology relationship, then with a special focus on artificial intelligence. And for the last 3 or 4 years, I've kind of seen my job there as trying to apply ideally data-driven frameworks for assessing US-China AI capabilities. I think if you kind of look back over these last 5 years, or even all the way back to 10 years, 10 years ago is when I moved to China. I lived there for about 5 years, worked as a journalist before coming back to the US. And if you go back to about 5 years ago, Chinese AI capabilities were a bit of a black box. And in a lot of ways, people in the US or people in the West, people in Canada weren't really paying a whole lot of attention to it. And then, fast forward to about 2017, 18, and suddenly you have this huge interest in Chinese AI capabilities. And when I say interest, both interest and concern in a lot of Western countries. And I found that a lot of that concern and interest is, I'm glad that people are paying attention finally, but it seemed not totally grounded in reality all the time. So I see my work as trying to, for policymakers, primarily policymakers in industry, try to put some foundations on the conversation about where the US stands, where China stands, and more recently where countries around the world stand in terms of AI capabilities. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and jump fully into presentation mode here. So as an outline, here are kind of the 4 things I'm going to run through in what will hopefully be about 25 to 30 minutes. So first up, how should we assess AI capabilities, and how have we assessed them over the past few years? And then kind of take 2 cuts at the question of assessing AI research capabilities, a more quantitative cut at it, and more of a case study where we kind of dive into ResNet, one super impactful paper, and the way that different institutions, different people, different countries kind of all played into that paper, and maybe what that can tell us, what it can tell policymakers about what it means if we try to disentangle some of these international research networks as this kind of, the movement within a lot of Western governments these days, particularly in the United States, the move towards decoupling, and just kind of wrap it up with some concluding thoughts. The nice thing here is normally I'm giving these type of talks, or I'm speaking to very policy audiences, people who are deep in the politics and not very deep in the technology. So I have to kind of dumb things down a certain level and do a little bit more explaining. And I'll be able to move through some of those pieces a bit faster, assuming people here have, if not a deep knowledge, at least a steady interest in machine learning and stuff like that. So see if we can balance those kind of considerations. First up, how should we assess AI capabilities, and how have we assessed them? So I put it in this, I'm looking specifically at the Chinese side of it, because that's where most of my attention goes, and looking at it from the wind over the last 4 years, when this kind of finally became a conversation in a lot of the West. So circa 2016, as I was mentioning just a moment ago, I think Chinese AI capabilities were really a black box. 2016 is just when you're starting to have the first conversations in a lot of Western technology circles around, oh, maybe China has something to offer here. Maybe this is something where this is a field where they actually have caught up faster than imagined. How will this be applied by the Chinese government, et cetera, et cetera. But when you actually kind of scratched a little below the surface and tried to get people to actually make, real assessments of AI capabilities, it really was a black box. People were giving extremely hand-wavy answers to any questions. Something like, oh, well, the West is good at research and China's good at applications. But that really doesn't tell you very much, and it's an assessment that's grounded more in kind of gut feeling than actual data or experience. So the period from 2016 to 2018 was a period when we started to kind of drill down and get a little bit more granular, and dividing AI or machine learning into a few of its key inputs and say, hey, if we want to assess China's AI capabilities or how those compare to the US, Canada, the EU, wherever, let's try to put a little bit of structure on it. Let's say, okay, how do they compare in the data dimension? How do they compare in the talent dimension? How do they compare in semiconductors and the policy environment? So, I'd say this is where we kind of got to in 2018. And this was an improvement, definitely an improvement over 2016, but still very hand wavy, stuff, very, very sort of crude assessments of China's data environment. Oh, they have so much data, and they have, because they have such a large population and no one cares about privacy. But stuff like that, it really doesn't tell you all that much. And so the project of the last couple of years that I've been engaged in, and a lot of people who kind of work on technology policy are engaged in, is drilling down further and saying, we can keep breaking these categories down into something more specific. And when we get more specific, we can apply data to that question. So, within data itself, you can look at data across these different dimensions, the diversity of data, the quantity, the quality, the depth. Within talent, you can talk obviously about engineering talent, research talent. You can talk about subfields, NLP, computer vision, et cetera. And a lot of what you've seen in kind of the best policy work around AI and ML over the last few years has been trying to zoom in on each one of these things and say, okay, where does China stand in terms of EUV photolithography, or how do we think the U.S. and China compare in their funding mechanisms? China has the quote unquote big fund, the Dajijin for semiconductors. What would U.S. policy look like? So again, this is kind of an improvement over 2018, but we're far from, we're far from there. The field is far from mature. So to kind of give a sense of how this process worked and where I focus, look at this sort of top 10% of a research question. This is one area where I think it's more straightforward to come up with quantitative metrics. Even if none of those metrics are completely comprehensive, we can draw data on these and make sort of direct comparisons. So that takes us to the second part of the talk, this quantitative approach that I put under the umbrella of the Global AI Talent Tracker, which is a digital interactive project that I built with Macro Polo over the past year. And so it's an online database that you can interact with, and it's totally free and open. And so I highly encourage any of you who, if you're interested in this stuff, take a look at it. First, I'll kind of go through the motivating questions. So I see it as three tiers. I think a lot of times when we talk about AI capabilities, we talk about them in very static ways. Where does the US stand? Where does China stand? Where does Canada stand? Where does EU stand? But, anyone in the field knows that these are actually pretty dynamic, and the flow of talent internationally is, really shifts these balances over time. So I wanted to break it down to three tiers. Where do these top AI researchers come from? Where did they grow up? Where did they go to undergrad? Where are they trained, or where do they sort of go to grad school? And where do they work today? And so that gives us, these are still obviously just snapshots, but it does give us three snapshots over time to hopefully get a sense of that, not just the balance of research talent, but the flow of research talent. And to do that, we just had to take a top AI research conference and then trace the career trajectories of the researchers with papers at the conference. So, essentially use all of the researchers with accepted papers at the conference as our data set, and then go through and figure out where did everybody go to college, where did everybody go to grad school, et cetera, et cetera. So for our conference, for this most recent one, we chose NeurIPS 2019. We worked on this throughout the first half of 2020, debuted it in June. Normally when I'm talking to policymakers, I have to say, why is NeurIPS important? What is it? I think many of you know it's considered a top conference for research on neural networks, leaning more in the kind of theoretical as opposed to applied direction. But maybe more important for the question at hand here is sort of the size of the data set, the number of authors who submitted papers and the number of authors with accepted papers. So NeurIPS consistently has one of the highest numbers of paper submissions, and it has one of the most selective paper acceptance rates of 21%. It's sort of right alongside a couple others that are similarly at 20%. So in the end, sort of our pool of authors ended up being something on the order of 4,200 authors. We, as a sort of a shorthand for people to understand this, we roughly equated those, 4,000 some odd researchers with accepted papers. We called it the quote unquote top 20% of global AI researchers. By that count, you'd only have about 10,000 AI researchers globally. It's all about, the denominator. When do we consider someone to be sort of a internationally relevant AI researcher, even a nationally relevant AI researcher? So we use the shorthand top 20%. I think as the more I think on it, maybe top 10% or even maybe more exclusive than that is the most appropriate. But from there, we did kind of what I just described of finding out where they went to undergrad, grad school, and where they work today. So this chart here, I'm going to kind of unroll a chart here. This one wasn't designed by me and my team. This was designed by the New York Times team, who did a nice piece with some visuals when we came out with our project, kind of relaying the conclusions. When we first look at this kind of column right here, undergraduate studies. So this is of the researchers in our sample who had papers at NeurIPS 2019, where did they go to undergrad? And the takeaways here are, pretty clear. The US, a very strong contributor. Europe, also a strong contributor. But China's actually in the lead here. China, if we think of, where people went to undergrad, which is pretty highly correlated with where they grew up, imperfect, but pretty highly correlated. China is actually the largest source country for researchers who will go on to present at NeurIPS. And it's, the US is definitely in play and Europe's in play, but China's head and shoulders above those groups, at least within our sample, and Canada's there at 5%. But things change a lot when you go from undergrad to grad school. So this is where you really see the US, kind of step into the light, step into the forefront. So when we look at where the same pool of researchers went to grad school, the US more than doubles its share to 52%. Well, China gets its share cut basically down to 1/3, or a little bit less than 1/3 actually. Europe sees a slight shrinkage. Canada sees a little bit of growth there, as does the UK, as does Israel. While India and Iran, who are some of the substantial contributors to this, start to essentially fall off the map. But then we add on post-graduation work. There's not all that much movement between grad school and post-grad, largely indicating that the majority of researchers who end up at this conference, they're working where they went to grad school. They're working in the country where they went to grad school. And so we kind of think of this as the current balance of top-end, neural networks focused, slightly theoretical AI research at the moment. So this shows us the three snapshots. It doesn't show us how the people move between one to the other stage. And so to do that, we've got to look at this a Shanky chart that we built out. So fundamentally, you can think of these three columns as the three columns I just showed you: undergrad, grad school, postgrad. What's different here is we can see really directly where did anyone go from one stage to the next. What's particularly cool about this is that you can click on any given node and it'll show you essentially everyone who passed through that. Where did they go from there? So click on India undergrad. We can see this is where all of the people who ended up at the conference who did India undergrad, this is where they went. This is those who went to Europe grad school. Or you can click like on the UK. This is, you see UK as drawing on a large pool of diverse talent. You're primarily focused on China, and so let's click on that undergrad here. You can see the story is pretty clear right from the jump here. So despite China being a large source country, actually the majority of those Chinese researchers end up going to the US for grad school. China is the second best. You see a smattering going to Australia, Europe, Canada, et cetera. And this, maybe from a US policy perspective, is the most important thread here. This is the number that go to grad school in the US and stay in the US after grad school. And that's a very large chunk, much larger if you were to compare it to those who go to grad school in the US and then afterwards head back to China. That's kind of this little stream right here. So, there's a big concern in the US, are we just training the next generation of Chinese researchers who then all, head back to China? And this data shows pretty clearly that, at least when we're talking about this kind of top end research talent that will end up publishing at international conferences, that doesn't really hold up. China, if we click on China as a kind of final destination, we see the big difference with the US. It's largely a closed system. Most people who end up researching in China today, they went to undergrad there, they went to grad there, they stayed there. You have a stream that goes to the US for grad school and then comes back to China or goes to Europe or Canada, but it's relatively small. It's much smaller than the share that either is fully trained in China or that goes to the US. And of course, the contrast here between China and the US as like a final destination is crystal clear. The US, it's just a vacuum cleaner for talent from all over the globe. And while I'm sure this isn't a surprise to folks like yourselves that are in the field and whatnot, it's a good illustration for policymakers who still think that the U.S. benefits from maybe excluding international research scholars or whatnot. So there is a ton more to explore with this one. Let's see. This is all available on the Macropolo website under the Global AI Talent Track, where you can search that. Other than just that kind of big Sankey diagram, we did a lot of sort of spin-off questions on, international research collaborations. Those who come to the U.S., do they stay there? What about the most elite researchers? What about the top institutions, et cetera, et cetera? So, if you're interested in this stuff, definitely encourage you to check that out on the site. Here, I'll quickly summarize the quantitative approach. And here, before I do that, I'll emphasize the limitations again. We're talking about NeurIPS as a sort of final destination that sort of biases this data set towards more theoretical research. And it's one group. It's a very large group. You've got over 15,000 people applying and over 4,000 being accepted, but it's just one group. I'd say, so maybe first I'll run through the conclusions, then do a little bit more after that. When we look at this type of AI talent, the US is the #1 producer, but that lead is very much built on attracting foreign talent. China is the top source country for AI research talent, but the majority of those researchers end up going to the US, working in the US, staying in the US. And over half of all top tier AI researchers are immigrants or foreign nationals who are working abroad. So again, while this is just NeurIPS focused, we did do a couple of gut check, quality control things, comparing this to a much larger basket of conferences. There's another great research project put together by a team in Canada, actually, I believe, that similarly looks at a large number of AI conferences. And they don't track the researchers over time from undergrad through the present day, but they do a snapshot of where these researchers work today. And when they expanded not from beyond NeurIPS to, I think, 20, 25 conferences, our percentages for the final balance were all within the margin of error for every country, so pretty close. This gives me some confidence that this is somewhat generalizable. I think you can find that, I believe it's called the Global AI Talent Report. I know the guy behind it is named Gagne. Really admire his work, so I encourage you to check that out as well. Okay, very quickly onto case study of ResNet. So, everything I've presented so far is very much in the vein of, where do these researchers come from? Where do they go to? Just kind of objective facts. With this case study, I try to dive a little bit more into, what does this mean? What are the implications for international companies, for international research networks? And what are the implications for governments, who are kind of the people I end up talking to most of the time, or government affiliated? So looking at ResNet, I'm imagine many of you are familiar with this paper, or at least have heard of it. One thing that kind of a fun fact about it is it's not just the most cited research paper in AI over the last 5 years, but actually, at least as of 1 year ago today, it was the most cited research paper in any field from 2015 to 2020. So huge impact within the field. Very briefly, This came out in December of 2015, and it was a very simple method for dramatically improving the performance of neural networks, sort of using this concept of residual layers to allow many more layers of a neural network to be stacked on top of each other without sort of losing accuracy or getting increasingly fuzzy as you go. So when first implemented, it was a computer vision technique, and it won, I believe, ImageNet that year, and a couple of swept all of the image recognition contests that year. But because it's fundamentally about strengthening the performance of a neural network, it can be applied to dozens, hundreds of other things. And that's really why it is so highly cited. Where did ResNet come from? So it came from a research lab called Microsoft Research Asia in Beijing. I'm sure some are familiar with it, maybe others not. It was founded in 1998 as kind of the first major foreign computer science research institute in China. And by being that kind of first mover, take yourself back to 1998, Microsoft was the, Google of that day. It was sort of the most prestigious, most attractive employer in computer science at the time. Maybe still is in a way. But when they opened the lab in China, I talked to Dr. Kai-Fu Lee, who founded the lab, and he said he really had his pick of the best grad students from all of China. This was one of the rare opportunities for them to stay within China and join a top-notch global research lab. And so right from the jump in 1998, it started producing really top-end work and also attracting a lot of the best talent from around China. One of the result of that was it kind of came to be known as what's called the Whampoa Academy of China's Internet. The Whampoa Academy is a reference back to a military academy in, I believe, the 1920s, 1930s, that trained a lot of the future generals and political leaders who would go on to head the People's Liberation Army, the Communist Party's army, and also the KMT, the Kuomintang's army in Taiwan. So it's kind of a place where a lot of elite people pass through. And it's very true of Microsoft Research Asia. A lot of China's top tech entrepreneurs and AI scientists all did time there, whether as grad students or researchers or whatnot. So the researchers behind this particular paper were these four guys: He Kaiming, Ren Shaoqing, Zhang Xiangyu, and Sun Jian. Without diving too deep into their specific biographies, I think the key piece here is that they were all trained within China. So they all went to undergrad within China, and they all went to grad school within China. I believe Sun Jian is the one who did grad school in Hong Kong. Hong Kong's relationship to China complex, obviously, but these were not scholars who, kind of came to the US, received advanced training, or went to Canada, received advanced training, and then went back and applied it in China. Really, homegrown talent. And the paper itself was, obviously made a huge splash right away. And the result was that they all sort of, opportunities opened up for them. They kind of had their pick of wherever they wanted to go to continue their research. And on a couple-year time span, none of them chose to stay at Microsoft, unfortunately for Microsoft. So He Kaiming, who was maybe sort of the most prestigious, the most immediately promising of the young researchers, he went to Facebook. As far as I know, he's still located in California, in Mountain View, researching at Facebook AI Research. Two of them, Sun Jian and Zhang Xiangyu, went to Megvii, aka Guangshi, or Face++, which is one of China's leading computer vision startups, facial recognition, and sort of rode the wave of the facial recognition surveillance boom throughout China. I believe Sun Jian's the chief scientist there, and Zhang Xiangyu is maybe like a senior scientist. Finally, Ren Shaoqing, he initially went on and founded his own self-driving car startup called Momenta, or co-founded it. He's now, I believe, the VP who does self-driving work at NIO, which is one of China's leading electric car startups. So, kind of zooming out for a second, we get all these guys. We have a group of Chinese-born, Chinese-trained researchers. We have a top international research lab setting up shop in Beijing. We have them all going in there, producing this cutting-edge work that then gets shared with the world. And then after that, they sort of go their separate ways. One to a major US company, two to a Chinese facial recognition startup, one to a Chinese electric car startup. So as we start to pick that apart, the question that a lot of people in the policy world want to know is who benefited. Okay, Microsoft went over there, founded this lab, and cutting edge work came out of it, but did the US win or did China win? The answer, of course, is always much more complicated than that. For this one, if we want to say who benefited, I think clearly the simplest and the biggest winner was global AI research and applications. This was applied widely and instantly had a huge impact on companies, obviously not just within China or within the US, but on companies and researchers and startups everywhere. So you could say that's a huge win for advancing the field of AI. Microsoft definitely benefited a certain amount, but when I talk to industry people, especially people at top labs about, did Microsoft kind of reap some big windfall from having this happen within their, in-house? Most people said, no, probably not. They had maybe a little bit of a head start in that they were aware of this breakthrough probably a few months before the rest of the world. But the paper was released pretty soon after being completed. And at that point, the knowledge is, it's global, it's universal, such that what most people said is, where Microsoft benefited the most is probably just in brand and in name recognition, kind of renewing its credentials as being one of the top global AI labs. MEGV, Face++, the facial recognition company, was definitely a big winner, managed to take home two of the top scientists, half of the research team. And, if a startup like MEGV wins, it's a bit unavoidable that the Chinese surveillance apparatus, the Chinese surveillance state wins as well. They're a big employee or a big contractor with MEGV in a lot of areas. And the fact is, when you improve facial recognition algorithms in this way, even if those particular researchers had not gone to MEGV, or even if MEGV didn't work with the Chinese surveillance apparatus, the fact is, when you're fine-tuning the capability to do this type of computer vision work, that will find its way into the Chinese ability to surveil its population. Finally, Facebook took on a leading AI researcher, and NEO as well. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. If you're a policymaker who's very focused on your national interests, did this benefit the U.S. or benefit China or benefit someone else? This is a bit of a mixed bag. There's not really clear answers, and I think it gets especially muddy when we kind of think about this through some alternate histories. No one ever has perfect foresight, but what if we took ourselves all the way back to 1998, and what if back then the U.S. government had said, hey, computer science, artificial intelligence, it's too sensitive. We don't want that research being done in China. Microsoft, you're not allowed to found MSRA. I think if the U.S. had done that back in 1998, that definitely would have hurt the Chinese development of the Chinese tech ecosystem. It would have hurt their ability, probably slowed them down substantially in AI. This was a top lab. It turned into a training ground. You combine top sort of international talent with top Chinese talent, and it definitely accelerated the growth of China's AI ecosystem. But the fact is, in 1998, almost no one in the U.S. was thinking about China as sort of a technological superpower that would one day rival the U.S. in technological capabilities and geopolitics. That wasn't really in consideration. Maybe more realistic is, what if U.S. restrictions had closed MSRA in 2014, as in many ways they kind of threaten to these days. If they closed in 2014, this is a year before ResNet comes out. The research team behind ResNet had already begun working together at this point. They'd already published some actually very big papers at this point. So if the U.S. government had then intervened and said, hey, we've got to decouple, we've got to shut this down, would those researchers have joined Microsoft in Seattle, created ResNet there, and maybe you wouldn't have had some of the knock-on effects in, promoting China's AI ecosystem or surveillance? Maybe, that's possible. But it's just as possible that these same researchers would have joined a Chinese research institute, maybe Tsinghua, maybe Baidu, maybe the Chinese government research institute, that I think would probably concern people in the U.S. government even more. And I recognize fully that I'm putting this a lot through the lens of the U.S. government. I know this is more of a Canadian audience. I apologize for that. This is kind of my lens onto the world, but happy to talk about it more in the Q&A. So, I think close it in 1998 probably holds China back substantially. Close it in 2014, not clear. And close it in 2020, I think, is a very big open question. I think the push for decoupling, not just in the US, but also in Europe, and I imagine to a certain extent in Canada, although much less so, the push for decoupling is kind of built on this idea that if we just cut China off, then we'll maintain our lead. And I think there's a big question when you look at papers like ResNet and other examples like this, there's a big question as to whether, kind of the cat is out of the bag on that, and you would actually be doing more harm than good by sort of severing these connections today. Something that, it's kind of too late, and at this point, it's a symbiotic system that you can't just isolate yourself within. So very quickly, conclusion, just in terms of how we assess AI capabilities, these capabilities are getting progressively more, the assessments are getting more granular over time. They're getting more grounded in data over time. We still have a long way to go. And I kind of, anyone who's interested in this kind of policy work, I really encourage you to get involved because there's so much work to be done. In terms of this sort of specific, very high-end research talent, the US has an advantage, but that advantage is built on importing a lot of top international grad students and having them stay in the US. And through the case study, seeing, as China's capabilities rise, the risks to the US of cutting itself off might rise as well. Maybe 10, 20 years ago, you could have said, decouple from China, cut these technology ties, and that'll hold China back. And at this point, it's not at all clear whether that will hold China back, or maybe that might even accelerate China's development. So really looking forward to the discussion. I hope to have some questions in the Q&A. And I love talking about this stuff. I love bouncing this stuff off, especially industry people who can kind of, critique and tweak the metrics and the concepts here. So if you're interested and want to chat, please do reach out to me by email. That's my Twitter, and Macropole is where a lot of this work can be found. So I will stop it there. And yeah, let's see if we got any questions in here so far. I'm gonna have to zoom up a little bit. Element AI, oh yeah. Okay, we've got a pretty good number here. So let me see if I can just sort through them a little bit. I appreciate Mark Donaldson throwing in Dajijin there. Where do you see China's role? This is a question from Mark Donaldson. Where do you see China's role in the next 5 years in their contribution to the global AI landscape, both hardware and software? Very, very big question. So I guess maybe you kind of have two parts of that question is, where is China going and what is China's contribution to global AI landscape? And I think the reason I'm dividing those is because I think there is a chance that over this next period of time, we might see an increasing sort of bifurcation of those. China has stated very clearly in its most recent government 5-year plan and in some big speeches by Xi Jinping and others that their goal is to achieve self-sufficiency, make that kind of a strategic pillar of the next 5 years. They want to be technologically self-sufficient. And that means that, this decoupling thing is not a one-way street. It's not just the US trying to decouple. China has also spent a long time trying to, in some ways, decouple from the US or from the West by saying a lot of this sort of maybe got a big impetus in the fallout of the Snowden revelations that, hey, there's a lot of security vulnerabilities. We do not want to be relying on foreign technology. And this is something that's been accelerated a ton in the last few years by U.S. Restrictions on semiconductor exports to places like Huawei. So in terms of what I think China is going to focus on domestically, there's obviously a huge focus on chips, on semiconductors right now. They recognize that is kind of the shaky foundation that their tech ecosystem rests upon. And so they're pushing that in a lot of different ways. We say maybe what might their contributions be that might be somewhat unique in that way, other than just kind of standard catch-up, is I think they are looking at a lot of ways to try to get around their limitations in semiconductor manufacturing. So, one example is right now they don't have access to EUV photolithography, which is basically the machine that lets you bring your chips down to 5 nanometers or below. So kind of like where the cutting edge is right now, it's going to go to 3 or 2 nanometers soon. China's kind of stuck at 7 nanometers in terms of their ability to do the photolithography. And so talking to people in the field, China's looking at ways to kind of circumvent this by not trying to make increasingly small chips or increasingly, down to 5 nanometers, but say, can they increase the power and the efficiency of their chips through like 3D printing and stacking and stuff like that. I'm not an expert in semiconductors by any means, but I think one area you might see is China essentially trying to get around hard limitations to technology access by engineering around it in semiconductors. So that's kind of one area that might be a little bit unique. In terms of more on the application side of things, I think China's at a point where it's going to be making a big push into the industrial applications of AI and other emerging technologies, where I think on the last 10 years in China was very kind of consumer focused, all about the apps, all about the platforms, all about e-commerce. And I think the next few years, we're going to see a major push into more industrial applications, the applications in smart manufacturing, smart cities, smart agriculture, definitely a big one, smart energy. If you wanted to see more about that, I recently wrote a long paper trying to forecast China's technological progress through 2025. It's called The Fragile Tech Superpower, China in 2025. And you can find that on Macropole. I go into a bit more detail there. So Tina Hope says, do you see the migration of AI researchers changing over time? I do. Maybe this is a super complicated question. I'll give a relatively short answer to it. Zoom back 4 years ago, 2016, I think I and a lot of other people were very, very concerned that the Trump administration in the US was going to, drive out large numbers of researchers, students would stop coming to the US, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of people were scared of this. I'd say in the period from 2016 to 2018, or maybe even 2016 to 2019, I and others were very pleasantly surprised at how little changed. The US was still the top destination for international students, still a top destination for international talent, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think it kind of drove home to me that these migrations are a little bit stickier. If you are someone who came from India to the US 15 years ago and got a green card and has established a life here, just because you have a president who, issues a lot of, frankly, racist rhetoric against people like you, it doesn't mean you're necessarily going to instantly pick up and go home. And I think the same thing for a lot of AI researchers. Maybe they don't have a green card yet, but they want to work at a top lab. There's only so many of those top labs in the world. If they have an opportunity in the US, they're still going to go there and take it. That's all pre-COVID. Then you throw COVID into the bunch and into the mix, and who knows? I think, I was very happy at how well the US managed to retain talent, but you throw in COVID just as something that like physically displaces a lot of people, and when you're physically displaced, you might just kind of decide to settle down wherever your new location is, and also just obviously kind of hit to US standing and to perceptions of US society and governance. So while I'd say my immigration stuff did not change as rapidly as I feared a few years ago, really don't know in the post-COVID world. I'm going to scan down here for next question. Thanks to David for sending in the Element AI Global AI Talent Report. That's the one I was thinking of. Let's see. Got a couple here. I'm just going to see if I can kind of synthesize a couple questions because I know we're coming up on time. So Alec Ho asks, where do you go to find out more about China's AI research efforts? So this isn't research specific. Well, I'll give two resources here. One of them is the China AI newsletter by Jeff Ding. He's a scholar at Oxford who does really good weekly or biweekly newsletter kind of dissecting and translating what's going on in China's sort of AI conversation. A fair amount of that does touch on research. It also touches on, business and ethics and all kinds of stuff. But I highly recommend the China AI newsletter for those involved. The other organization that I think is really does excellent work on this, and that I think will be coming out with their own kind of version of a talent tracker, is called the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown University. It's a new research organization called CSET for short, Center for Security and Emerging Technology. They put out a ton of great reports. They're again kind of US focused, but they do spend a lot of time on China. And if you kind of poke around through their reports, there is a lot of good stuff on Chinese capabilities and research and whatnot. Let's see. I'll do a couple of just like quick methodological questions. One is, how recent is the data that you presented? Is the data updated frequently? Larger, do you draw conclusions in larger time spans? So the data here that I just showed is from the 2019 conference. It's from one conference, and the 2019 conference happened in December. So it's almost the 2020 conference starts next week. So essentially this data is exactly 1 year old. We have done, so that was the 2019 conference. We also, at Macropola, we did a version of this for the 2018 conference and the 2017 conference, but essentially we did sort of smaller subsets for each of those years. And 2019 was the first year we kind of blew it out in full to look at all global researchers from all countries to all countries. 2017, we looked at just the papers that were chosen for oral presentation. So it's kind of, NeurIPS is already the best of the best, and this was the best of the best within NeurIPS. 2018, we looked just at Chinese researchers, and 2019, we blew it up for all researchers. The goal next year is to then expand it to an even larger group and start to have this time series. But that's something, kind of got to stay tuned for that. Got a question here on the AI dynamics in the coming Biden administration in terms of regulation and policy. Very good question, something I spent a lot of time trying to figure out. So there's sort of the AI piece of it and the China piece of it. I'm obviously always kind of looking at the intersection of those two. I think I might be overly optimistic right now, but at this point, I am pretty optimistic about the incoming Biden administration in terms of sort of global technology policy and policy towards China. That the kind of chart I had there at the beginning showing, the way the conversation on global AI inputs has gotten more granular and more data-driven over time in just these last 4 years. In that same span of time, there's been a whole sort of ecosystem of technology-focused think tanks and researchers in DC, and most of them basically being part of kind of like the larger democratic or progressive foreign policy world. Not saying they're all Democrats, not saying they're all progressive, et cetera, but just knowing a lot of the kind of connections, many of them have ties to past administrations, or I think at least have in some way the ear of present or future administration. So big picture, I'm optimistic that people have had a lot of time to think about these questions. And now I hope that those, deeply thought out responses are going to go into action. Probably going to get totally messed up by politics, but that's the best you can do. In terms of something specific, just like on what we're talking about here, I think the student and international research component of it is going to be the main change within Biden. Biden's not going to suddenly decide, oh, we're great friends with China again. That's politically unfeasible, and it's just not smart. The conversation, China has changed, the conversation has changed, et cetera. But I do think you see an alignment between sort of broader progressive priorities around immigration, openness to, international immigrants, international researchers. That's kind of like a general purpose progressive policy. And I think that it's also something that meshes very well with what we see in terms of this attracting top research talent piece of it. So, I think we're definitely going to see changes in terms of the openness and the welcomingness to foreign students, foreign researchers, foreign technology workers through like the H-1B visa program. And then I think we're also hopefully going to see a much more strategic approach. The Trump administration, I think a lot of people in the China world have almost like a grudging appreciation for some of the things that Trump did, and that he moved us into a much more, moved us to be much more focused on China as a competitor. Again, I'm saying us, the US. I apologize for that shorthand. But I think now that Trump has kind of moved the conversation over there, but in a wild and crazy and erratic way, I think it's now time to kind of settle that down into much more strategic and structured policy. Yeah, Biden listens to scientists. Let me see if there's any way, any other questions to kind of summarize in here before signing up. Let's see. Mark asked, do you see a decoupling or a doubling down on Chinese researchers contributing to U.S. and Western nations AI research capabilities? I would say I do see a decoupling going on here. Like I said, through the first few years of the past administration, we didn't see this, sudden exodus. But, I think it's a very natural reaction that when the country you're from, whether you love your government or you hate your government, or, whatever relationship you have to your own country, your own government, et cetera, the fact is when that country is kind of consistently demonized by or attacked by people from the outside, it's going to double down on your kind of patriotism and your desire to contribute to the strength of that country. And this is something that I have seen a lot in the last, I don't know how many years. You could say 2 years, 4 years, or you could even zoom it out to 5, 10 years. This kind of growing sense that among young Chinese people, they want to contribute to their country. They want to do something to kind of contribute to their own country's growth, which is a very natural reaction that most people in most countries have in one form or another. So I think that's a piece of it. And another piece of it here, we're all talking, or, I was all talking about the US or the Western side of it. Are we attractive? Are we driving them away? Are we pulling them? But the fact is, it gets much easier to stay in your home country to work. The more elite universities, the more elite research labs, the more elite companies exist in your own home country, the more likely you are to stay there. Like at the time of Microsoft Research, when it moved into Beijing, if you wanted to participate in the cutting edge of kind of computer science research and engineering, you kind of had to go to Silicon Valley. There weren't a whole lot of other hubs back in 1998. Even all the way up through 2010, 2012, 2014, there still was this huge kind of agglomeration of talent and of top-end labs and companies in the US. But the fact is that's changing. It's changing because of the growth of these ecosystems in China, in Beijing, Hangzhou, Shenzhen, wherever. But also in other countries. And that's kind of one of, I think in the US, we kind of take for granted that people want to come here. And we don't recognize that a lot of times that's driven by the fact that there maybe aren't a ton of options in their home country to do this work. And when there are options over there, no guarantee they're going to come this way. Let's see if there are any other ones to answer. Let's see. Maybe I'll do a kind of a last one here unless something pops up. Alec Ho asked, is self-driving technology a good measure in terms of capability? How would that be measured? It's a good question. I think self-driving is a good measure of certain things, and maybe kind of the strongest measure it is of the ability to integrate a lot of complex elements of an ecosystem into one sort of game-changing product. So, in the US, largely self-driving car ventures have taken the approach of like, we're not going to bet on any changes in the roads, in the highways, in sensors, and any of that. We're just going to need to build our cars to operate within that environment. Whereas in China, you have a different approach, which says, yes, it would be great if these cars could just operate totally independently, and they do a certain amount of pursuing it that way. But there's also very much an interest in local governments saying, hey, we want to be the self-driving car hub. what can we do to attract a top-end company to set up shop here, maybe to set up a kind of a testing grounds here, maybe to work to build sensors into the roads, into the streetlights, et cetera. And so, it's not an apples to apples comparison when you look at the way this is developed in the West versus in China and maybe other places, but it's kind of a good like ecosystem type competition thing, in the sense of, I think it's pretty universally acknowledged that the leading US companies are ahead of China in terms of the raw technological capabilities underpinning self-driving. They've been doing it for longer. Algorithms are better. In most cases, the data they've collected is greater. That might be changing quickly nowadays as China sort of catches up. But the US had kind of technological advantages on all fronts, or performance advantages on all fronts. And the question would then be, can a more coordinated, public-private kind of joint progress on self-driving, can that overcome those technological advantages? And I think that's still a totally open question. I'm not an investor and I'm not placing bets on one side or the other. I do think that in China you will have a smoother regulatory and kind of social ethical road once things start getting deployed. When there are accidents, as there will inevitably be accidents, I think Chinese kind of society, political system is going to have a bit more ease dealing with those rather than in the US. That's not saying, whatever, Chinese people don't care about, human life or any of those stereotypes. But it is saying that there's maybe a bit more of a utilitarian approach to say, hey, it's worth rolling this out. There's going to be hiccups, but let's do it. Whereas in the US, you can imagine all of and I say US always, probably a lot of Western countries, be a lot more of complex, hashing out of the rights, the responsibilities, the liabilities, all that kind of stuff. So I think that's essentially all of the questions that I saw up there. Really enjoyed this. Really glad to get to bounce these ideas off of all of you. And thanks for staying. And like I said, feel free to get in touch by email, Twitter, LinkedIn, whatever. Because I always learn a ton talking to other people who are interested in these same questions. So I'm happy to do that with all of you. Thanks very much, and have a good one. Enjoy the rest of the conference.